Welcome to Studio Sprout, where we come together to make art, have fun, and grow. And today we are doing an art and science experiment called salt painting. And in this project, you're going to see with your own eyes something called capillary action. I'm going to break that down in what I hope is a very simple way for you to understand. Capillary action is when liquid moves up or outward through a very narrow space. We usually see capillary action in porous materials. A porous material is something that has little gaps and spaces of air in it. So you can think about things like a sponge or wood, fabric, or even paper. And one of my favorite porous materials where you can actually observe capillary action is a paper towel. So let's look at liquid moving through a paper towel. And if you think about it, we use paper towels to soak up liquids all the time. Well, where does the liquid go? The liquid goes into the gaps of air in that material in the paper towel. So I'm gonna try and not make a mess here and show you capillary action in action. This is a paper towel. Well, it's a little mini piece of a paper towel. And I have some purple liquid watercolor. Ooh, this is tricky. I don't want to spill it. So I am going to hold this paper towel up so that you can actually see the liquid moving upward. I mean, oftentimes we can see liquid moving downwards because of gravity, but how would a liquid travel upwards? Well, the answer is capillary action. Let's watch this and you tell me what you see. Okay, I'm going to put that liquid in there. Wow! Instantly, that liquid is traveling up the paper towel. So the cool thing about capillary action is that it helps liquids move up, but it also helps liquids move outward and sideways. And we are going to see that in our salt painting. And you might say, well, salt's solid, it's not very porous. But what's happening in our salt painting is that we are going to use glue. We're going to shake the salt onto the glue, and then there's going to be tiny little gaps and spaces in between the salt crystals and the glue. And when you add watercolor with either a dropper, that's my favorite, but if you don't have a dropper, you can use a paintbrush. So when you add the watercolor to the salt, you're going to see it moving through the little spaces and the little gaps between the salt crystals. And that's capillary action. I bet you're excited for this. Let's jump into the video and I'm going to teach you how to do salt painting right now. I highly suggest doing this project on a cookie sheet or a tray to catch all the salt. I'm using a thick piece of watercolor paper. I have a small container to hold my salt, along with a spoon, and I'm using regular white squeeze glue. I will show you a few different ideas of ways you can use your glue, and I bet you'll come up with ways that I haven't even thought of. For the first art piece here, I'm moving my glue slowly across the page in one long, continuous, looping line. If your glue line breaks while you're moving, slow it down just a little bit. This is a fun, relaxing way to do your first salt painting. Now that the glue is complete, let's get the salt ready. You could sprinkle the salt in a variety of ways. I am starting with a spoon and a small container, but you could also use a salt shaker. You could also pick it up with your fingers and sprinkle it around a pinch at a time. Start on one side of the page and sprinkle the salt over the glue a little bit at a time. Pay attention to where you've already sprinkled the salt. Look for the wet glue and make sure that it's covered. I can see a lot of the salt is just sitting on the paper and not attached to the glue. So I'm carefully lifting up the paper and giving it tiny little shakes to shift around the salt so it moves on to the wet glue. I'm going to do my best to collect the extra salt back in the container. This is where it's very helpful to work over a tray or cookie sheet. Some of my salt landed on the tray, but I was also able to reclaim some and I'm going back over all the glue one more time to make sure that it's completely covered with salt crystals. When you are satisfied that your glue is covered with salt, you can shake all the extra salt onto the cookie sheet and carry that over to the garbage to throw away. For this salt painting example, I'm going to use liquid watercolor right on top of the salt before the glue is dry. That's right, the glue is still wet. I'll be using droppers for most of this today, but you could also use a brush, and I have a little water to clean my brush just in case. Let's go ahead and get the liquid watercolors set up. If you don't have liquid watercolors, no worries, just use a regular watercolor pan set. You can use your brush along with your watercolor pan set, and I'll be showing how that works later in the video. Okay, if you've ever used watercolor with me, then you know I love to start with yellow because yellow is light and bright and the first color to change and get mucked up. So we're going to use the dropper and do little drops in various areas all around the salt. I'm squeezing so gently. Do you notice how a tiny little drop of watercolor moves along the line of salt and glue? And have you also noticed already that the watercolor stays on the line of salt and glue and doesn't go off onto the paper? Watch the upper corner how the orange paint spreads through the salt crystals and along the glue line. This is a friendly reminder to choose the colors that you want to use. I'll be using red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. These are our 3 primary colors and our 3 secondary colors. They're also the 6 colors that make up a traditional rainbow. You could keep this project simple and just pick 2 colors that you enjoy doing side by side. Let's test out the brush a little right here too. I'm barely touching the salt with my brush. It's working quite well, just as good as it was with the dropper. I think the trick is to be very gentle. When your salt and glue line are completely covered with paint, you'll leave it flat on the table to dry. This video is all about teaching you the basics of salt painting so that you can start experimenting on your own. In this example, I let the glue completely dry before adding paint. I'm noticing on this experiment that the watercolor spreads better and faster and farther through the dried glue and salt. You'll have to experiment yourself and tell me what happens for you. Just like before, I'm being very careful with my movements. I'm positioning my dropper right over the salt so that the liquid watercolor falls right onto the path of the glue. And you can see it spreading in both directions as it touches the salt. Let's see how the paintbrush works with the dried glue and salt. It works, but I see the paint moving slower through the salt. I'm guessing that the watercolor pan set has thicker paint than the liquid watercolor, so it moves slower through the spaces in between the salt. Now, I don't know that for sure, it's just a hypothesis or what we would call a guess, but it's based on observation and experience. Your job as both a scientist and an artist is to pay attention to what's happening. I highly suggest doing a salt painting with the glue wet and a salt painting when the glue is dry, and comparing your experience and results. You will probably notice some similarities and some differences, and I'd be very curious to hear about your experience. Even though the glue is dry, the paint is still wet, so I will let this dry flat on the table. This is the salt painting with the watercolor completely dry. On a small piece of paper, I'm going to make a salt painting rainbow. I used my finger as a guide at the center bottom of the page to create that first arc. Then I'm working outwards, giving a little space in between each line. I'll be doing a classic rainbow, so I'll need 6 lines, one for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. I'm applying even pressure on my glue bottle. That means I'm squeezing the same strength as I do each line, and I'm moving slow and steady so there's no breaks in my line. Remember, use an old tray under your art so you can collect any extra salt that doesn't stick and it doesn't make a mess. Once your glue is covered with salt, you decide whether you wait for the glue to dry or you paint on it wet. I'm experimenting here with liquid watercolors and a brush. Throughout the video, I've shown several options that prove that you can do this project with whatever you have on hand. So use a watercolor pan or liquid watercolors and a brush or a dropper. Or if you have both, you can experiment and see what you enjoy. Watching the watercolor spread through the salt never gets old. It's so cool how it moves on its own. I'm going to speed the video up so you can see what the finished rainbow looks like. This part of the video was to give you an idea of an alternative to the line doodle. I hope seeing the rainbow got your creative wheels turning. You can draw whatever you want with your glue. You could do your name, you could do a pattern and design, you could even create a whole scene and picture. Let's zoom in one more time and see this up close. The name of the game, whether you're using a brush or a dropper, is to be gentle and precise. When I say precise, I mean you want to land that watercolor right on top of that glue and salt. If you do, you're going to see it magically spread over and over again. This brings us to the end of our salt painting video. If you haven't already started creating alongside me, go grab your materials, get set up, and have fun.